And then what? Inside stories of 21st century diplomacy. It's a colourful insider account of European diplomacy. It's clear our politics would have turned out better if we'd had more Cathy Ashtons. Cathy Ashton was the EU's first High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security. Effectively, Europe's foreign policy supremo, responsible for coordinating the EU's response to international crisis. Delighted to be joining me live on the line. Catherine herself, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Good to have you. Where do we find you on the planet today? You look very comfortable anyway, wherever you are.
Thank you. I'm in London, actually, at home. So it's very nice to be doing this as the start of my day.
Wonderful.
And great to be going to Spain.
Yes. Sunny. But it is sunny, but as you remarked on my rather fashionable hat, it's a bit cold this morning. But anyway, we'll keep calm and carry on. I was surprised to read that you were the first High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security. So presumably before then, how did the EU respond to the various challenges, shall we say, that was put in front of them?
So there were different people doing different jobs, and essentially you had three different operations. You had what's called the Council, which is all the member states, all the ministers would come together. They had somebody that worked for them that did foreign policy on behalf of them. Then you had the Commission, which is like the bureaucracy of Brussels and of Europe, the kind of the government departments, if you like. And they had somebody who looked at external relations, looked at things like development and aid, and looked at sort of strategic links to countries. And then you had the fact that every 6 months a different country holds the presidency of the EU. That still happens in a lot of issues. And in that presidency, that country would play a key role. So you had these three different roles, and we brought them all into one, which was why I'm called the first. So there was work going on before, but I did the 3 in 1, if you like.
The 3 in 1. And how did your career lead to that particular post? Because we were always told, it's those faceless bureaucrats in Brussels, and and they're always from the Low Countries, and they're for some state that we never heard of. But obviously, you're very much British, I would imagine, judging from just slightly from the accent. So, how did your career lead to that one?
So I'm from the north of England as well, which you'll hear, even though it's a long time since I lived there. I'm very proud of being from the north. So some things happen in life by accident. And one of the things I talk about in the book, as you know, is a kind of accidental journey. Because sometimes especially the kind of worlds I work in, it's not that you plan to do something, it kind of happens to you. And so I'd arrived in Brussels, to my surprise, having watched my name on the ticker tape underneath the TV screens as the person going to Brussels, and sort of sat and wondered, oh, well, that's interesting. And then almost equally, a year later, when they were choosing the first High Representative, there was some very clear criteria. The Brits were very important to Europe. They wanted the British to play an important role. They needed, frankly, a woman, because all of the other big roles were taken by men. And it was important, I think, to demonstrate that they were inclusive to that extent. And all of the other roles had been taken by the Conservative parties. And I was actually a Labour Party politician. So woman, British, Labour Party. I was the one they knew.
Ticks all the boxes, as they say.
Yeah.
And we talk about being sort of the European, the EU High Representative, but it's not just European issues, is it? I mean, anything, your remit can take in the response of Europe to international crisis. Haiti, for example.
Well, that was the thing. It wasn't really, people often think I know much more about Brussels than I do, because I was hardly ever there. My job was to be on the plane representing Europe outside. So as you rightly say, the earthquake in Haiti, which happened not long after I'd been appointed, and which I try and describe in the book, because the book's about trying to take people into foreign policy, to sort of say, come with me, it's just me. Come into this room and see what it's like to be involved in these things, and see what we're really thinking and feeling and what's going on, and hopefully make it accessible.
And that's going to be one of the problems, because you look at, or one of the challenges, because if you look at the way that, people say, oh, Europe, and it was all this super state, as people were saying. But the national characteristics of each set of peoples. I mean, Kosovo, the Balkans, that particular area is a case in point, and one that you can't treat with broad brushstrokes. It has to be tailored particularly, and that in itself is a highly tuned skill.
But you're so right about needing to be clear with each of the situations that I described and many others, exactly what it is you think you can bring to it. We should be realistic and determined on that. And the great thing about having 28 countries involved, as it was then, is that you had experts from everywhere. You had people with huge knowledge. Just geography alone meant that some places were better known to some countries than others. And just the coordination, if just going back to Haiti for a minute, just coordinating so that people sent all the different things that they needed. Not that everybody sent water and tents when actually they needed 5, 10, 20, 30 different things. Those kind of things matter too. But in Kosovo, it was also, for me, about showing that there was something uniquely Europe, that there were things that Europe could do that individual countries couldn't do. And for the Kosovo and for Serbia, the pull was getting into the European Union. The best way for the Western Balkans to guarantee peace, security, stability, and a future stronger economy was to be part of the EU. And so that pull, which is what we call soft power, it's a kind of the pull of something that is economic or political, gives you a leverage that you can use to try and help them reach agreement between them on some really difficult issues.
Soft power is a great way of putting it, because it'd be easy to go in there, all guns blazing, with tents and with vehicles and with a European flag on you, and go, here we are, and lots of selfies and lots of press conferences, and actually very little getting done. But it is, the diplomacy should be one of the most covert of skills, surely.
Brilliantly put. Yeah, it's what I call the drip drip. That when you look at the photograph of the success, look at the people in the second row, the third row, the people who will have been doing the work constantly, maybe for years. When we did the Iran negotiations, I chaired them for 4.5 years. I didn't finish them. I didn't start them. That you have to be prepared to keep going. And in a world where we are moving quickly and information people want very quickly, it's quite important to keep some things kind of in the shadows, keep them working away until you're able to kind of reach a conclusion. So it is covert, it is quiet, it is in the background, and it's really important.
Well, that's the difference, isn't it? Because politics, if you like, is, especially these days, we've had several world leaders who seem to thrive and make policies on social media. No names, no pack drill. And that's, politics is the art of the social media, the immediate reaction, because we now live in a world where you have to be seen to be doing something immediately, whilst what you were doing was more long-term. As you said, you weren't there at the beginning, you weren't there at the end, but you provided that stability during a certain period.
Yeah, and it's quite challenging, because there's always, when you create a new role like this, you've got 28 countries' media, plus international media that's interested in you. And I think one of the things that I struggled with was how to balance wanting to say things and needing not to say things. So it was quite important to me that every now and then I was able to demonstrate that we could achieve something, because, again, any new job, people go, well, what's going on here? And as I often say to people, when I was appointed, it was like when you read the book and then somebody makes the film and the person in the book doesn't look like the person on the film. Well, I wasn't what people expected in any way at all. And so you had to kind of prove quite a bit that you are capable of doing something. And I tried to do that by showing the things that we could do that were Europe-wide, that were important to countries like my own, that was very important to me, but that we could do by doing something different. And it was about keep going like a kind of tanker at sea, keep going, keep being determined to succeed if you can, being prepared to take risks, And, being prepared to fail as well.
Because from failure, you learn. Simple as that.
Yeah.
Because not everything, it's unfortunately, life isn't a Hollywood movie where we all rush off hand in hand through fields of tulips to a glorious sunset. And sometimes that things don't work out as planned.
That's right. That's right. No, that's right. And it's really important because if you only take on the things you're going to succeed at, that you're going to succeed at, you're never going to take on things that are more difficult. And if you look around the world at the moment, there are a lot of issues that are really challenging that you need people to be working on without necessarily feeling that there's a great chance of success, but being prepared to have a go.
Anyone who has sat through what we call a community meeting in Spain, where you have everybody in an urbanization sitting down once every year, normally in August when they come down from Madrid, will know that those things can take about 5 hours. You basically book the day off as you decide who's going to pay for the swimming pool repairs, etc., and who's going to paint the outside, and why you can't have a barbecue on your terrace, and that can go on for days. And I'm just all seem like it, and I'm just thinking, how on earth, with 28 member states, do you ever get anybody to sign an agreement? Or were there some cases in the nicest possible way that you had to say, okay, we're moving on because we can't be here because you do want your barbecue on the terrace, manner of speaking?
Well, funnily enough, Brussels is the only place in the world where when the ambassadors get together, because they always prepare before the ministers arrive and try and get as much agreement as possible on issues. But it's the only place where failure is when you stick to your national position and won't move. Mm. Normally as an ambassador, your job is to defend your country and to be absolutely determined on your position. But in Brussels, success is when everybody finds a compromise and finds a way through. And if you're the country holding out, it doesn't do you any good. It doesn't do your career any good as a diplomat, but it doesn't do your country any good. So it's the only place in the world where success is finding a solution.
And of course, what you were doing is you're a constant there. Whilst in democracies, politicians come, politicians go, new waves of thinking, shall we say, come across. And so that must have been quite challenging as well, dealing with the ebbs and flows of the political tide across Europe.
Yeah, there was always an election somewhere, is what I would say. You would constantly find that amongst 28 countries, and you could tell because sometimes foreign ministers would make interesting and slightly off-subject speeches at a meeting, and then they would go off and do a little press conference to say, I have just said this really important thing. And you think, there must be an election coming. And that meant, too, that the politics would change because different coalitions would come in, different political parties would win. And often the foreign minister would be the leader of a coalition party. So somebody of enormous importance in the country and somebody who may perhaps have different views to the prime minister or the president, but certainly would have strong views. And so always managing this constant kind of movement was, I found it really interesting, actually, because it was great fun to build this team. I chaired 50 of these meetings over the 5 years and 12 informal ones. We never voted. We never failed to reach agreement. That wasn't because I was brilliant. I'd like to tell you it was. It was because this push and drive to actually make sure that we got to an agreement was so strong and so much part of the Brussels framework.
And yet there are those who would snipe, who would go, ooh, Brussels, ooh, gravy train, diplomats, ambassadors, having long meetings on expenses accounts. I told you. So it must be, on the one hand, you've got to have a wry sense of humor. Because if you put yourself up for something like this, trust me, I got an email in yesterday which made me sort of A, go, what? And B, chortle to myself because at least I got a reaction. But on one hand, it must be, you've got to have a thick skin, or you've got to know how to deflect those remarks, and also not only from the public who believe in one thing, but also from politicians who come in, because as we said, there's an election. You may get people from the fringes who believe that you're basically Lucifer incarnate operating out of Brussels. So you've got to have a fairly have a fairly secure view of yourself as well, haven't you?
I found that part of it the hardest, but I don't have a thick skin. I don't want one. I think it's actually important to always relate to what's going on and the people that you're trying to work with. And for me, most of my time was spent with people whose lives are in turmoil and chaos, and you're trying to help. So, yes, there's a lot of feeling of, Brussels should be better, it should be less bureaucratic or whatever. And there's always a need for people in Brussels to constantly look and say, well, do people have a point of the things we should be doing, things we could be doing better? What I would say is it is quite remarkable that you bring 28, 27 now, different governments, cultures, histories together, and in a sort of bureaucratic model, manage to get them all to sort of be able to work together and stick together. And that's not an easy thing either.
And this is one of the things, because I'm 55 years old. Okay. I grew up in the 80s. I remember the Berlin Wall. I remember watching the Berlin Wall coming down and my mother crying, watching it. And I came to Spain in the 80s, and as Spain and Portugal came into the EU, and we were Europeans, and I've always considered myself a European, and I'm lucky enough to be living in the EU. And I went to an international school, and we had 320 kids and 32 different nationalities. And that was a melting pot. And it brought home that although we have differences, we are all the same. Doesn't matter what we had kids who, it was 1980, it was in the late 80s, and we had kids who were Iranian, and we had kids who were Iraqi, and they had fought, and literally their brothers and sisters had fought in the war that was going on at the same time. But there was still, and it made debates interesting, but it's still common ground. And for people who say, well, Brussels, we're better out, or it's not fit for purpose. And then you think of how this all came about, and the chaos and the displacement of people after 1945. And that is why it is vital that there's an EU, and it's vital that all these countries work together.
One of the things that you learn as well, just adding to that, is that when you're facing any kind of crisis, whether it's internal or external, there is no issue that any nation can tackle alone. If you think about the pandemic or climate change, which is the number one issue we face, the consequences of war and chaos with the invasion of Ukraine, the issues that rage across the world in economic terms, our relationship with China and how we develop that, what we should do about cybersecurity, all kinds of different issues. None of them are issues that you can simply look at internally. You need allies. And the question really for countries is how best to do that. As you know, Britain decided not to be in the EU. That was a decision taken. But it still has to work as closely as possible with countries to ally itself on issues of security and defence, which is why it's part of NATO. You still have the United Nations, which is a bit battered and bruised, but is still important in my view. And that collaboration is what's going to help any individual country get better economically. You need trade. We all like to travel, but being able to travel safely and securely is about international relations. In other words, it's all domestic in the end. It's all about how do you make your country, your continent as strong as possible and able to provide for the people in the best possible way. Well, I'd say democracy is number one on that. But close on the heels of how you set up governments has got to be, how do you relate to the countries around you? How do you relate to the rest of the world? How do you keep people safe and secure? And that's all about building alliances, building contacts. So whether people are for or anti the EU, if you simply sit back and think about how does a country work, it has to have relationships outside. It can't operate on its own.
What would you say was give me the highs and give me the lows. Let's start with the low first, and then we'll finish on a high, because that's what we like to do. But what would you say was if you like, the darkest moment or the most challenging moment during your tenureship?
There are a number to choose from, really. I think the consequences of the earthquakes in Haiti and Japan were much more devastating as a person, because you realize that within moments, literally moments, life completely changed for a whole range of people, especially for a lot of children. And that you saw the human spirit pick this up and move forward. But you would literally stand and look at the devastation, and it was really tough to imagine what it must have been like and the chaos that ensues from that and the sense of what it does to people. So darkest moments are always those moments when you are with people who want what we want. You know, they just want a life that is secure, that gives things for their kids, that just helps them in the future. So those are the darkest moments when you realize just how awful it's been. And the highs are when you think you might have done something that could help. So when we reached agreement between Serbia and Kosovo, it was the first agreement. It was tiny steps. It was not going to change the world, but it was just a start. Or, of course, for the Iran agreement, when that was what was needed to prove that Iran at that point was not building a nuclear weapon. And when you began to see the possibilities of being able to negotiate other issues. So there are those great moments of when you've worked for years with your team, with your colleagues, with other countries and got somewhere. There's nothing quite like that.
Do you miss it then? I mean, what do you do now? I mean, I'm not saying you're sitting at home with, in London with your potting shed or something like that. But I mean, or was it a case of, okay, it's been a while now. I'm glad to step back because my goodness, it's not the sort of thing at 5 o'clock you go, okay, there's not a lot of clock watching, I should imagine, at the sharp end of what you were doing.
No, there were never any. There weren't holidays. There weren't days off. There weren't. My life belonged to the job for those 5 years, and I was very tired at the end of it. There's a limit, I think, to what you can realistically do, particularly if at the same time you're building a new foreign service. So I would be literally sometimes in the middle of the night looking at plans for design of the building and what chairs we should have in, and I designed the food court.
Oh, you did?
Wasn't a food court in Brussels. I did.
Gotta have a food court. I mean, come on.
Well, somebody's got to decide how people are going to get fed. It might as well be me, kind of thing. So I was really tired. So I was glad to stop. And what I've been doing since, and the book is part of it really, is a combination of still helping where I can to continue the work that I was doing, writing and talking about it, and especially talking to students and young diplomats and anyone really who's interested to know what it's really like. Because if you're an ordinary person, and that's what I am, in an extraordinary set of circumstances, you can sometimes bring people into that and give them insight. And so I do lots of different things, but my favourite thing is talking to people and explaining, especially to young people who are thinking about foreign policy, is please, go into this world, because it's so important that we get people who are willing to do it.
And when it comes to writing this book, I mean, there's so much to write about, presumably sort of boiling it all down to something that wasn't the size of War and Peace on steroids must have been quite a challenge.
Well, I was lucky because my husband, was a journalist, he interviewed me when I came back from the big trips, the Iran talks or the Serbia, about Egypt and Libya and the earthquakes that I'd visited. And he would just put a tape recorder and say, okay, let's just chat. And then he gave me the tapes at the end. And what's amazing, I'm sure your listeners will have this experience, how much you forget until you re-listen. You think, oh my goodness, I'd forgotten about this. And so I boiled it down to 7 stories. And each one is about a place and about a time and about me going there and taking you with me, hopefully. But doing so that I can show you the things I learned as well, because it's a journey that if you take, you kind of learn a lot at the end of it.
The book is called And Then What? It's by Catherine Ashton, who's speaking to today. Inside Stories of 21st Century Diplomacy. It's out now, and it's also available as a virtual download from our own virtual bookstore. If people want to find you online, Catherine, where can they go? Do you do the dreaded tweeting? Can they do Instagram? Have you a Facebook page? How can they do you LinkedIn? How can they find you?
I don't do any of that. Because I'm from the wrong generation, actually, but also because I prefer a quiet life.
Well, you've certainly had an interesting one at the EU. The book is called And Then What? It's by Catherine Ashton, who is speaking today. Catherine, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure.